Syria is today holding its first parliamentary election since the fall of the Assad regime. Polls have already closed in some centers and counting has begun. The country is still recovering from more than a decade of civil war, which ended last December when Islamist insurgents ousted President Bashar al Assad. Syria is now led by interim President Ahmed al-Sharaa, a former commander of the Islamist faction Hayat Tahrir al-Sham. Here he is arriving at a polling station in Damascus. However, there is no direct vote for the parliament, known as the People's Assembly. So-called electoral colleges will choose two-thirds of the seats, with al-Sharaa selecting the rest. Not all regions are voting either. Authorities have suspended the polls in 3 provinces for what they say are security reasons. So, if Syrians aren't voting directly for the candidate standing for office, how is this election supposed to work? DW's Beirut bureau chief Mohammed Shetra traveled to Damascus to break it down for us.
Syria is holding its first parliamentary election since the fall of the Assad regime. But the vast majority of people in Syria won't be voting. So what's going on? The interim government says they haven't had time to update or verify the records of Syria's citizens. Millions have been displaced or no longer have documents. So they're holding an election via indirect voting. And yes, it's complicated. So far, the government has appointed a Supreme Elections Committee. And that Supreme Elections Committee has appointed subcommittees in each of the regional governorates. These subcommittees have selected members to serve on electoral colleges. And they are the ones who have the right to nominate themselves and vote to select members of the People's Assembly. Who are these people? Well, there was a formula for that. 70% of the candidates were picked based on their qualifications, while 30% were selected from local notable community figures. On Sunday, the Electoral College members will vote to elect representatives of the Syrian People's Assembly. But not all of them. They're electing 140 out of the 210 seats. That's 2/3. The remaining 70 will be appointed directly by the president. And of Syria's 14 regional governorates, 3 are not having any kind of election at all. Voting is not happening in Suwaida, which is controlled by Druze armed factions, or in Raqqa and Hasaka, which are under the control of the Kurdish-led Syrian Democratic Forces. Authorities have postponed elections in those areas until conditions allow. The constitutional declaration for the transitional period is as close as Syria has to a constitution. It says the People's Assembly elected on Sunday will govern until a permanent constitution is adopted and real direct elections are held. How long could all this take? Well, the interim parliament's term has been set at 30 months and could be renewed.
I asked Mohammed why polling has already closed in some centers and why the window for voting is so limited.
Let me pick up from the explainer to add that it is clear by now that 13 out of the 140 seats will remain vacant until the elections are held in Suwaida and largely in most of Hasaka and Raqqa provinces. And the representations for these regional governorates will be partially through among the 70 individuals that the interim President Ahmed will be directly appointing, at least for now, until the elections are held then. So yes, we could say it's a short polling process in time, and that's given the limited number of voters among the electoral colleges. For instance, the polling station behind me here in Damascus, the process here has just been completed. We just learned that sorting of votes has just started behind me, behind this door, and we rather expect the results to be announced soon.
I understand you were there when President al-Sharaa arrived at a polling station in Damascus. Tell us about that.
Yes, so the interim President Ahmed al-Sharaa paid a visit to this polling station here in Damascus and, overlooked the election process and said that it's a a historic day for Syria. It's a milestone towards rebuilding the country. He says it's a very important process at this stage because Syria needs a lot of legislation, and that will open the door for legislation in the time being. And he said that it's a very important process also because it allows to better monitor the performance of the government and hold it accountable.
So again, most Syrians are not voting in this election. How do they feel about this entire process?
Yeah, it really depends on who you ask. This is a controversial election process, I would say, and Syrians have been divided between pro-government people who understand the government narrative that they are unable to perform a public vote at this stage. They cannot, they don't have the time to arrange and update the registration data of millions of Syrians, and there's millions of Syrians abroad, so it can't happen at this stage. And there seems to be some sort of understanding for this, but critiques have, said that this is not a democratic election. This is not what they wanted, and they added that this is not an election that they see as representing all the Syrian minorities and all the Syrian mosaic.
Mohammed, what's your sense? What result are most people expecting?
Well, it's very hard to say what do we expect out of this election. It's very unclear how the power dynamics will be once there are a parliament here in Syria, given that all the candidates were nominated on individual basis. There's no parties, there's no coalition, no lists. As you know, that the interim constitutional declaration came and dissolved all the existing parties, most of whom were affiliated with the Assad regime. And since then, there has been no setup for laws and regulations to form new parties, and therefore everyone is nominated and a candidate based on individual basis. It's very hard to say how the power dynamics will play in that area.
DW's Mohammed Shetra in Damascus. Thanks for your reporting. For more on this, I'm joined now by Ghassia Ohanes, a Syrian, and my colleague, who we should mention has produced a report which we hope to bring you later on this afternoon. Ghassia, greetings. Viewers will have noticed we've been calling this an indirect election. What does that mean? How does it work?
Right. So the people we saw in the polling stations casting their ballots are actually not the general population, but part of electoral committees. Now, these committees were picked in the weeks leading up to this election, and it starts from a chain leading all the way back up to the government. So the government actually appointed committees who then chose subcommittees. So a lot of people are saying these seats that are being voted for are not fully independent still because it links back to the government. Now, when it comes to the other seats, 70 out of 210 are actually, there's no vote at all. It's directly appointed by Ahmed al-Sharaa. So all in all, a lot of people see this and they say, okay, if you take a closer look, it's actually all being picked by al-Sharaa himself. And I've heard this from a lot of Syrians myself.
So how are Syrians' minorities being represented here?
A lot of the criticism when it comes to this election comes from the minorities. It's because of what we're seeing, actually. Only 14% of the participants in this election, the candidates, have been women. And when you confront a lot of government supporters with this, they say, well, at least they have representation. So it kind of seems like we have very different expectations for representation and what kind of representation. Just because you have, 3-4 women, it doesn't really mean that women who are more than half of society are actually represented. And I feel like because of these differences, there's been a lot of criticism. There's also all the provinces that you mentioned because of security concerns, but also because they're outside of the security control of the government. 1/3 of Syria to this day is still outside of the government's control. So they say, how can we hold elections? But people in those regions say, then why are you holding elections to begin with? Because if we're not represented, how can we build a country together?
So most importantly, what do people in Syria think about this process?
Right. There's a lot of fragmentation. And while there is some support for this process because people say, well, this is how we move forward. We need to bring in this parliament. We need to bring in technocrats, people who have the qualifications so that they can, with legislation, fix the problems that we have. But on the other hand, you have victims of atrocities that were committed in the lead up to this election. I mean, in the months before, after this government took over, there's been two very notable massacres on the coast and in the Sueda region, both targeting minorities. So minorities have been very vocal in saying, we don't have security, we don't feel safe in our own country. And if we don't feel safe in our country, how can we even talk about holding elections at the moment? So for them, security, negotiations with all these factions who control areas outside of government control needs to come first.
Yeah. At the end of the day, the most important question is, can this be seen as a step forward for Syria, this entire election process?
Well, it definitely shows that the government does want to do something to improve the situation in the country. They're looking to get the legitimacy that they're looking for, especially when you look at international actors. They want to build those relations, and we've seen al-Sharaa go out on the UN stage and represent Syria for the first time in decades. So they want to build these relations, but people inside Syria are saying they're going about it the wrong way. Yes, they want to build a government, but first you need to address the differences that exist within the country. You can't just overlook that. There's still active armed conflict within Syria, and until you address that, it's like you're in a building, one of the rooms is on fire, and you're just closing the door and trying to repair the rest of it. It doesn't work. Eventually, they're saying that those parts that have conflict, they're going to get more and more deeper into conflict because you're not engaging with them. You're not building diplomatic ties with them, and you're not trying to resolve the existing problems.
Painting a clear picture of the political landscape in Syria. DW reporter Ghazir Ohanis, many thanks.